The first snow came early that year, catching the mountain passes before most folks had finished laying in their winter stores. From where she crouched behind the feed bins at May's boarding house, the girl who had no name watched fat flakes drift past the cracked window, each one a tiny promise of the hard months ahead. "Girl," May's voice cracked like a whip from the kitchen. "Where'd you disappear to now these dishes won't wash themselves?" She didn't answer. 20 years of living had taught her that silence often served better than words, especially with May Henshaw, who'd bought her papers from a traveling merchant 4 years back and never let her forget the debt. The woman's footsteps thundered overhead, searching the upper rooms first. That gave her maybe 3 minutes. Through the frost-hazed glass, she could see Reverend Pike's bent figure making his way down the muddy main street of Prospect's Rest. The old minister clutched his worn Bible against the wind, his free hand pressed to his hat. He'd asked her again yesterday if she'd chosen a name for herself yet, same as he'd been asking since she'd first arrived in this frontier town. "The Lord knows you by your heart, child," he'd said, his rheumy eyes kind despite the bitter cold. "But the law of man requires a name for its records. Have you given it any thought?" She had. Every night she lay in her narrow cot in the boarding house cellar, trying on names like other girls might try on Sunday dresses. Mary, Elizabeth, Sarah. But none of them fit. They all belonged to people who'd been wanted enough to be named by someone who loved them. "Found you, you lazy creature." May's meaty hand closed on her shoulder, yanking her to her feet. The older woman's face was flushed with anger and exertion, her graying hair escaping from its tight bun. "Hiding again while there's work to be done, and after I've fed and sheltered you all these years." The girl kept her eyes down, knowing from experience that meeting May's gaze would only fuel her temper. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henshaw. I was just—" The slap came quick and sharp, snapping her head to the side. "Don't you dare make excuses, mister. Garrison will be here tomorrow, and this place needs to be spotless. You know what's riding on this." She did know. Lloyd Garrison, the territory's most successful cattle broker, had recently become a widower. May had been trying to catch his eye for months, convinced that marriage to such a man would elevate her from boarding house keeper to respectable ranch wife. The girl suspected Mr. Garrison had other reasons for his visits, reasons that had more to do with the younger women who worked the saloon across the street. But she kept such thoughts to herself. "Yes, Mrs. Henshaw." "Good. Now get to the kitchen. And if I catch you shirking again, you'll sleep in the woodshed tonight, snow or no snow." The kitchen was a disaster. Last night's poker game had run late, and the miners had eaten and drunk their way through most of May's stores. Grease congealed on every surface, and the smell of stale tobacco smoke clung to the air. She tied her threadbare apron tighter and set to work, her hands already raw from the lye soap. It was near midnight when she finally finished. May had long since retired, satisfied that the main rooms were presentable enough for Mr. Garrison's visit. The girl's back ached, and her empty stomach had given up growling hours ago. She'd managed to save a heel of bread and some fatty scraps from the beef May had been trimming for tomorrow's stew. As she ate her meager meal, Reverend Pike's words echoed in her mind. The law of man requires a name. But what name could she claim? She'd been girl or hey you for so long that sometimes she forgot she was entitled to anything more. A soft knock at the kitchen door made her freeze. At this hour, visitors meant trouble. She crept to the window and peered out, relieved to see the Reverend himself standing in the swirling snow, his shoulders hunched against the cold. She unlatched the door quickly. "Reverend Pike, what brings you out in this weather?" He stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late, child, but there's a family up at the mining camp, the Kowalskis. Their youngest has taken with fever, and they're in desperate need of medicine." "The camp's 5 miles up the mountain," she said, glancing toward the stairs. "In this storm, I know it's asking much." The old man's face was grave. "But you're the only one I trust to make the journey. You know these trails better than most." And you've a good heart. The medicine's already prepared, Doctor. McKee left it with me before he was called to the Henderson ranch. She thought of May, sleeping soundly upstairs, of Mr. Garrison's impending visit and the fury that would follow if she wasn't here to serve breakfast. Then she thought of a child, burning with fever while snow piled against the cabin walls. "I'll need a horse," she said. Pike's face creased with relief. "Take mine. She's old but sure-footed. And child." He pressed a small leather pouch into her hands. "This is for you. Call it an early Christmas gift." The pouch was heavier than it looked. Inside. She found more money than she'd ever held at once, enough to buy passage on a stage. Maybe even enough to start fresh somewhere May's reach couldn't follow. "Reverend, I can't." "You can and you will." His voice was firm. "I've watched you these 4 years, seen how you care for others despite your own hardships. You deserve a chance at something better." 20 minutes later, she was mounted on Pike's old mare, the medicine secured in her saddlebags. She'd left a note for May, claiming urgent women's trouble that required her to visit the doctor. It would buy her a few hours at most, but by then she'd have delivered the medicine and could decide what came next. The storm had worsened. Snow drove sideways, stinging her exposed skin and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The mare picked her way carefully up the familiar trail, but the usual landmarks were disappearing under a thick white blanket. She pulled her thin coat tighter and leaned forward, trusting the horse's instincts. An hour into the journey, she knew she was lost. The trail had vanished completely, and the mare was struggling through drifts that reached her belly. The girl tried to turn back, but the wind had erased their tracks. Every direction looked the same, a wall of white punctuated by dark pine shapes that could have been anywhere in the Beartooth Range. The mare stumbled, her hoof catching on something hidden beneath the snow. They went down hard, the girl barely managing to kick free of the stirrups before the horse rolled. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed awkwardly on the frozen ground. The mare struggled to her feet and bolted, disappearing into the storm before the girl could grab the reins. She tried to stand, but her ankle buckled. Not broken, she thought, but badly twisted. The medicine pouch had spilled from the saddlebag during the fall. She crawled through the snow until she found it, clutching it against her chest. At least if she died out here, they'd find the medicine with her body. Maybe someone would get it to the Kowalski child. The cold was seeping through her wet clothes now, making her limbs heavy and her thoughts slow. She'd heard about freezing to death, how it supposedly felt warm and peaceful at the end. Right now, all she felt was a bone-deep exhaustion. She must have closed her eyes, because suddenly there were strong hands lifting her, and a voice rough as bark saying words she couldn't quite make out. The last thing she registered before darkness took her was the sensation of being carried, and the incongruous warmth of another human being against the killing cold of the storm. When she woke, the first thing she noticed was the absence of wind. The second was the warmth, real warmth, not the false promise of freezing. She was lying on something soft, covered in heavy furs that smelled of wood smoke and pine. "Easy there." The voice came from her left. She turned her head slowly, taking in her surroundings. A small cabin, barely larger than May's kitchen, log walls chinked with mud, a stone fireplace crackling with blessed heat, and sitting on a three-legged stool beside her, a man she'd never seen before. He was maybe 30, maybe older, hard to tell with mountain men. Dark hair hung past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that held her attention, gray as the winter sky. They watched her with a mixture of wariness and concern. "You were half frozen when I found you," he said. "Another hour and—" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. That's when she realized her clothes were gone, replaced by a rough wool shirt that hung past her knees. Her wet things hung on a line near the fire, steaming gently. "I didn't look," he said quickly, correctly interpreting her alarm. "Got you warm first. Worry about propriety later. There's no one here but us, and I've seen enough death by cold to know modesty's a poor trade for a life." "The medicine," she croaked, her throat raw. "There's a child." "Found it." He gestured to the pouch sitting safely on a shelf. "Storm won't break before morning at least. No one's going anywhere tonight." She sank back against the furs, suddenly aware of how close she'd come to dying. "Thank you." He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said quietly. "They wouldn't." He studied her for a long moment, then rose and moved to the fire. She noticed the limp then, the way he favored his left leg. On the wall behind him hung an old badge, tarnished and neglected. Deputy Sheriff, Wyoming Territory. "You hungry?" He didn't wait for an answer, ladling something from a pot hanging over the fire. "It's just venison stew. Nothing fancy, but it'll warm your belly." The stew was the best thing she'd ever tasted. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, while he sat in comfortable silence. The storm howled outside, but in here, with the fire crackling and her body finally warm, she felt safer than she had in years. "What's your name?" he asked eventually. She looked up from her bowl, meeting those gray eyes. For once, the answer didn't shame her. "I don't have one." His expression shifted, but not to pity or disbelief. Instead, she saw something like understanding, as if he too knew what it was to be defined by absence. "Well then," he said finally, taking her empty bowl. "I suppose that's something we'll have to fix." Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them in this small, warm space between the wild darkness of the mountain and the uncertain future that waited beyond. But for now, for this moment, she was no longer cold, no longer hungry, no longer alone, and maybe, just maybe, no longer nameless. The fire crackled and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the rough-hewn walls. Somewhere in those shadows, she thought she glimpsed the shape of possibility, the outline of a life that could be more than servitude and silence. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The medicine still needed delivering. May would discover her absence, and this stranger with the deputy's badge and the wounded past would want answers she wasn't sure she could give. But tonight, she was alive, and for someone who'd never even had a name to call her own, that felt like the beginning of everything. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world transformed. Through the cabin's single window, she watched the sun rise over peaks that looked carved from crystal, every branch and rock face glazed with ice. It would have been beautiful if she wasn't thinking about the Kowalski child, still waiting for medicine. "Snow's too deep for travel yet," the man said, following her gaze. He moved stiffly in the morning cold, that limp more pronounced. "Give it a few hours for the sun to work on it." She nodded, pulling the borrowed shirt closer around herself. Her own clothes were dry now, but she was reluctant to change back into them. They smelled of lye soap and May's kitchen, of a life she wasn't sure she could return to. "I should introduce myself proper," he said, busying himself with a coffee pot. "Elias Wolf. Been living up here about 3 years now." "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Wolf." "Elias." He poured 2 cups of coffee, the real stuff, not the chicory brew May served. "And you're welcome. Though I'm curious what brings a young woman up the mountain in the worst storm of the season." She explained about the sick child, the Reverend's request. He listened without interrupting, those gray eyes thoughtful. "The Kowalski place is only 2 miles from here," he said when she finished. "I can guide you there once the trails are passable. But first, breakfast. And maybe you could tell me how someone comes to have no name." It wasn't a demand, just an observation offered while he sliced bacon into a cast-iron pan. The smell filled the small cabin, making her stomach rumble despite last night's stew. "I was found," she said quietly, "in the desert. According to the woman who had me before May, I was maybe 3 or 4, following a wagon train that had passed days before. No one knew where I came from. The woman who took me in called me girl or foundling. When she died, her cousin sold me to a traveling merchant, and he sold my papers to May. Elias flipped the bacon with more force than necessary. Sold like property. It's not uncommon. She kept her voice neutral. Orphans, especially girls without names or families, we're useful. May needed help with her boarding house. She paid my price and got my papers. I work. She feeds me. It's legal. Legal doesn't make it right. The bacon sizzled and popped. He cracked eggs into the grease, then slid a plate in front of her. Real eggs. Not the watery powdered stuff May bought cheap from the commissary. Why didn't the woman who found you give you a name? He asked, settling across from her with his own plate. She said it wasn't her place, that names were given by blood or taken by choice. And since I had no blood family and was too young to choose, she shrugged. I grew up being nobody in particular. They ate in silence for a while. The food was simple but good, and she found herself relaxing in his presence. He didn't push for more than she wanted to give, didn't look at her with pity or calculation. You can read, he observed, nodding toward the small shelf of books near his bed. She'd been studying the titles while he cooked. Some Reverend Pike taught me, though May doesn't know. She thinks education gives people ideas above their station. And what ideas have you gotten? She smiled, the first real smile in longer than she could remember. That somewhere out there, people live differently, that maybe I could too, if I was brave enough. He refilled her coffee cup. Brave enough to ride into a blizzard to save a child you've never met? I'd say you've got courage to spare. The compliment warmed her more than the coffee. She studied him over the rim of her cup. This strange man who lived alone on a mountain with books and a tarnished badge. Why here? She asked. Why live so far from everything? His expression shuddered. Sometimes far from everything is the only place that's safe. She recognized the deflection, the way he turned away to tend the fire. Whatever drove Elias Wolf to this isolated cabin was his secret to keep, just as her namelessness had been hers. I should change, she said. The day's wasting. He gestured toward a corner screened by a hanging blanket. Take your time. I'll check on the horses. I've got a mare that can carry us both to the Kowalski place. While he was outside, she changed quickly back into her own clothes. Though she folded his borrowed shirt carefully and left it on the bed, the cabin was small enough that she could take it in with a glance the necessities of survival. Nothing more, except for the books, and except for the badge on the wall, which she studied more closely now. Deputy Sheriff, Wyoming Territory. The metal was tarnished but not damaged, as if it had been deliberately put away rather than lost. Below it, barely visible, scratch marks on the wall. She leaned closer and made out words carved into the wood. Justice is truth in action. Benjamin Disraeli. Elias said from the doorway. She jumped, embarrassed to be caught snooping. British Prime Minister. I carved that when I first came here, to remind myself why I was hiding. You don't have to explain. Maybe I do. He hung his coat on a peg, snow melting from his shoulders. You trusted me with your story. Seems only fair to share mine. He moved to the stove, pouring fresh coffee like he needed something to do with his hands. I was a deputy in Laramie. Good at it, too. Maybe too good. Started noticing shipments going missing, railroad money ending up in the wrong pockets. When I tried to investigate, I found the rot went all the way up. The marshal himself was taking bribes from Hiram Collier. The railroad baron. The very same. They needed someone to blame for a payroll robbery that went bad, left 2 guards dead. I was convenient new in town. No family to ask questions. Marshal Luther Briggs himself led the posse that came for me. He touched his left leg unconsciously. Took a bullet getting away. Holed up in these mountains and let them think I died in a ravine. Been here ever since. Waiting for... I don't know what I'm waiting for anymore. The weight of his confession settled between them. She understood now why he lived like a hermit, why he'd looked at her with such recognition when she'd said she had no name. He'd lost his too, in a different way. "The medicine," she said gently. "We should go." He nodded, grateful for the redirect. "I'll saddle the horses." The journey to the Kowalski cabin took longer than expected. The snow had drifted deep in places, and they had to dismount several times to lead the horses through. Elias went first, breaking trail, and she followed in his footsteps. The mining camp was a collection of rough cabins clinging to the mountainside like barnacles. Smoke rose from most chimneys, but the Kowalski place was ominously still. "Hello, the house," Elias called out as they approached. The door cracked open, and a haggard face peered out. "Who's there?" "Friends," she said quickly, holding up the medicine pouch. "Reverend Pike sent us." The door flew wide. Stefan Kowalski was a bear of a man, but his eyes were red with worry and exhaustion. "Blessed Mary, you made it through that storm. Come, quickly." Inside, a woman sat beside a small bed, bathing a child's fevered face. The boy couldn't have been more than 6, his breathing shallow and labored. "The medicine," Stefan said desperately. "Please, how do we—" She was already moving, drawing on every scrap of knowledge she'd gleaned from watching Dr. McKee work. "Boil water. We'll need clean cloths and a small spoon." For the next hour, she worked with single-minded focus, preparing the medicine according to the doctor's written instructions, coaxing it between the child's lips drop by drop. Elias helped without being asked, his hands steady and gentle as they lifted the boy so she could get the medicine down easier. Slowly, painfully, slowly. The child's breathing eased. His fever didn't break, but it stopped climbing. Color returned to his mother's face. "He'll need doses every 4 hours." She explained, showing Mrs. Kowalski how to prepare the medicine. "All of it, even if he seems better. Doctor." McKee was very clear about that. "Bless you," the woman whispered, clutching her hands. "Both of you. We have no money, but—" "You have a sick child," Elias said firmly. "That's payment enough." They stayed until they were sure the parents understood the treatment, then began the journey back. The sun was high now, the snow beginning to soften. She rode behind Elias on his mare, arms wrapped around his waist for balance. "You did good in there," he said as they picked their way down the trail. "Have you worked with a doctor before?" "Sometimes, when May loans me out for extra money." She felt him tense at that. "It's how I learned to read. Actually, doctor, McKee leaves medical books lying around." They were nearing his cabin when they spotted riders below 3 men picking their way up the trail they'd broken earlier. Even from a distance, she recognized the lead rider's bulk. "That's Garrett," she breathed. "May's man. She must have sent him after me." Elias guided the horse off the trail into a stand of pine. "How much trouble are you in?" "All of it." Her mind raced. The money Pike had given her was hidden in her boot, but it wouldn't matter if Garrett dragged her back. May would find it, take it, and the punishment would be severe. "There's another option," Elias said quietly. "You could stay here for a while, until you figure out where you want to go." "I couldn't impose—" "You wouldn't be— Gets lonely up here, and I could use help with the winter chores." She thought about it as the riders passed below, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. Thought about May's heavy hands and Mr. Garrison's visit and a life measured in other people's demands. "I don't even have a name to give you," she said. He turned in the saddle to look at her, those gray eyes steady. "Then maybe it's time you chose one." The riders were moving away now, following the false trail toward the higher passes. In a few hours, they'd realize their mistake. But by then, the choice would be made. "June," she said suddenly. "The woman who found me said it was June when they picked me up in the desert. Maybe I could be June." "June." He tested the name, nodded. It suits you. New life, new name. Seems fitting. As they watched Garrett's party disappear around a bend, she felt something shift inside her chest. For 20 years she'd been nobody, owned and ordered and used. But here, on this mountain with a man who understood what it meant to lose yourself, she could be June, just June. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. "Let's go home," Elias said, and if he noticed how she startled at the word home, he didn't mention it. They rode back to the cabin as the afternoon sun painted the snow gold and pink and all the colors of possibility. Behind them, her old life searched the wrong trails. Ahead, something new waited to be discovered. She was June now, and June, she decided, was brave enough for whatever came next. The wolves came with the first heavy snow of December. June heard them before she saw them, long, mournful howls that echoed off the canyon walls and made the horses nervous in their lean-to shelter. She stood at the window, watching gray shapes move between the trees like smoke given form. "They're early this year," Elias said, checking the load in his rifle. "Usually don't come down this far until January." 2 weeks had passed since she'd chosen to stay. 2 weeks of learning the rhythms of mountain life, hauling water, splitting kindling, tending the fire that could never be allowed to die. Her hands had new calluses now, different from the ones May's lye soap had left. These felt earned somehow, like proof she was building something rather than just enduring. "Will they attack?" she asked, counting at least 6 shapes prowling the tree line. "Not if we're smart. Wolves are opportunists. Make it too hard for them, and they'll find easier prey." He set the rifle by the door. "But we'll need to bring the horses inside tonight. Can't risk leaving them in the lean-to." Together they cleared space in the cabin's main room, moving Elias's few pieces of furniture against the walls. The horses, his steady mare, and the aging gelding he'd traded for last week crowded the small space, their breath steaming in the cold air that rushed in through the open door. "Cozy," June said, trying to lighten the mood as the gelding knocked over a stack of books. Elias almost smiled. She'd noticed he did that more lately, almost smiled, almost laughed, as if joy was something he was slowly remembering how to feel. Just mind where you step come morning. That night, the wolves grew bolder. They circled the cabin, their claws scratching against the walls, testing for weakness. June lay in her bedroll by the fire. Elias had insisted she take his bed, but she'd refused, compromising on the warmth of the hearth, listening to their huffing breaths just inches away through the logs. "They can't get in," Elias said from his watch position by the window. "Cabin's built solid." "I know." But knowing didn't stop her heart from racing when something heavy thumped against the door. "Does this happen often?" "First time in 3 years they've come this close. Something must have driven them from their usual hunting grounds." A gunshot cracked through the night, echoing from somewhere down the mountain. Then another. The wolves went silent, heads turning toward the sound. "That came from the direction of the crow camp," June said, sitting up. Elias was already pulling on his coat. "Could be trouble. Wolves, or worse." "I'm coming with you." "June, I'm coming." She was already reaching for her boots. "You said it yourself, we look out for our neighbors up here." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Stay close, and bring the medical supplies." They saddled the horses quickly, the wolves having melted back into the forest at the sound of gunfire. The moon was full, casting everything in sharp silver relief as they picked their way down the treacherous trail. More shots rang out, sporadic now, and June could see the orange glow of fires through the trees. The Crow winter camp sat in a protected valley, usually far enough from the mining operations to avoid trouble, but as they drew closer, June could hear angry voices mixing with the crackle of flames. Several tippies were burning. "Stay back," Elias warned, but she was already spurring her horse forward. The scene was chaos. A group of miners stood at the camp's edge, torches in hand, shouting slurs and threats. Some of the Crow warriors had formed a defensive line, but they were outnumbered. Women and children huddled behind them, and June could see at least 2 people on the ground, wounded. "That's enough," Elias's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The miners turned, and June recognized several faces from town. Jake Morrison, who ran the assay office. Tom Garrett, the same man who'd come looking for her. And leading them, Lloyd Garrison himself, May's prospective suitor. Well, Garrison said, his words slightly slurred. "The hermit comes down from his mountain, and he's brought May's runaway with him. These people have done nothing wrong," Elias said, positioning his horse between the miners and the crow. "Go home before someone gets killed." "Someone already has," Morrison spat. "They killed Ben Tucker's boy, found him dead by the creek. We're here for justice." "You're here because you're drunk and looking for someone to blame," June said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "I treated the Tucker boy last month for pneumonia. If he died, it wasn't by violence." "Listen to her, playing doctor," Garrison sneered. "Just like she plays at being better than she is, May's worried sick about you, girl. Time to come home." "This is my home now." One of the Crow warriors, a man named Joseph Whitecrow, whom June had met when trading herbs, stepped forward. The boy fell through ice while checking trap lines. "We tried to save him, but the cold took him too fast. His father knows this. He grieves, but he knows." "Lying savages," Morrison muttered, raising his torch higher. The fire reflected off something metallic at Elias's hip, his old deputy's badge, which June had never seen him wear before. He must have grabbed it on the way out. "You boys have 2 choices," Elias said, his voice carrying the authority of his former profession. "You can turn around and head back to town, sleep this off, and remember that you're better men than this. Or you can push this further and find out why Luther Briggs wanted me gone so bad he was willing to frame me for murder." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Some of the miners shifted uncomfortably, the mob mentality beginning to crack. "You're no lawman," Garrison said, but his bravado was fading. "You're a wanted man hiding in the hills." "Maybe, but I'm also the man standing between you and a mistake you can't take back. Your call." For a long moment, the night balanced on a knife's edge. Then Morrison lowered his torch. "Come on, boys, it's late." One by one, the miners retreated, though Garrison's eyes lingered on June with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. Only when the last torch disappeared into the trees did she breathe again. "Thank you," Joseph Whitecrow said simply. "Will you help with the wounded?" They worked through the night, treating burns and cuts, setting a broken arm where a warrior had fallen defending the camp. June found herself translating between Elias and an elderly woman who spoke little English but knew traditional remedies that might help with the smoke inhalation. "You speak some Crow," Elias observed as they worked. "Bits and pieces. Reverend Pike taught me. He said understanding your neighbors starts with understanding their words." She finished wrapping a child's burned hand. "These people have been nothing but kind to me. They didn't deserve this." Dawn was breaking by the time they finished. The camp was salvageable. Only 2 teepees had been completely destroyed, and the tribe was already organizing to rebuild. Joseph Whitecrow pressed a bundle into June's hands as they prepared to leave. "For your help," he said, "and for standing with us." The bundle contained dried meat, medicinal herbs, and a small beaded pouch. "This is too much." "It is exactly enough." Joseph's wife, Mary, interrupted. "You risked much coming here, in these mountains. We remember such things." On the ride back, June clutched the gifts tightly, moved beyond words by the gesture. Beside her, Elias was quiet, that deputy's badge still glinting at his hip. "Why did you put it on?" she asked finally. "Because they needed to see it," he said. "Men like Morrison and Garrison, they respond to symbols of authority, even when the authority is gone. And because," he paused, choosing his words, "because for the first time in 3 years, I remembered why I became a lawman in the first place. to stand between the strong and the weak, to speak for those who can't speak. They created a rise, and the cabin came into view, smoke still rising from the chimney they'd banked before leaving. Home, June thought, and the word settled warm in her chest. Garrison won't give up, she said. He'll go back to May. Tell her where I am. They'll come looking. Let them come. Elias's jaw was set. You're not property to be retrieved. You're a free woman who made a choice. The law might not see it that way. My papers are a bill of sale for someone who no longer exists. He turned to look at her. You're June now. June who helps her neighbors and stands up to mobs and isn't afraid of wolves or men who act like them. That girl they're looking for, she's gone. As if to punctuate his words. A wolf howled somewhere in the distance, but it sounded far away now, hunting other trails. The immediate danger had passed, but June knew this was just the beginning. Word would spread. Questions would be asked. The peaceful isolation of Elias's mountain couldn't last forever. But for now, they were safe. They unsaddled the horses, tired but oddly exhilarated from the night's events. Inside the cabin, June added wood to the fire and started coffee while Elias cleaned his rifle and hung the deputy's badge back on its peg. You should wear it, she said impulsively. Not for them, but for you. To remember who you really are. He touched the tarnished metal gently. Maybe someday, when I've earned the right to wear it again. Outside, snow began to fall once more, covering the tracks of wolves and men alike. June thought about the crow camp, already rebuilding, and about the miners slinking back to town with their torches extinguished. She thought about choices and consequences, about the different kinds of courage it took to survive in these mountains. Elias, she said, watching him move about the cabin with that slight limp, this man who'd saved her from the snow and was teaching her to save herself. The boy Morrison mentioned Ben Tucker's son. I think we should go to the funeral, pay our respects, show them that we're part of this community too, whether they like it or not. He considered this, then nodded slowly. That's brave of you. I'm learning, she said simply, from the best teacher I know. This time he didn't almost smile. He actually did, and the warmth of it rivaled the fire crackling in the hearth. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the white wilderness, wolves sang their ancient songs. But inside the cabin, there was coffee and conversation and the quiet understanding of two people finding their way back to who they were meant to be. The mountain had tested them with wolves and men consumed by hatred. They'd passed that test, but June knew harder ones were coming. Marshal Luther Briggs was still out there. May wouldn't give up easily, and Garrison had looked at her with the eyes of a man who didn't like being denied. But those were worries for another day. Today, she was June, and she was home, and she was learning that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born to, or in her case, the one that bought you. The beaded pouch from the crow camp sat on the table between them, a symbol of alliance and respect. In these mountains, she was discovering, you survived by standing together, and standing together, they just might be strong enough to face whatever came next. The letter came on a day when the world seemed made of glass. Ice coated every surface, turning ordinary branches into crystal sculptures that chimed in the wind. June was outside gathering kindling when she saw the rider approaching not from town, but from the east trail that connected to the larger roads. Elias, she called softly, not wanting to startle him. He was splitting wood, had been at it for an hour, working out some restlessness that had plagued him all week. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold, and followed her gaze. His hand moved automatically toward where his gun should be, then relaxed when he recognized the rider. That's Samuel Worth. He runs messages between the settlements. Worth was a reed-thin man who seemed to exist on coffee and determination alone. He swung down from his horse, ice crackling from his coat. Wolf, miss, he touched his hat to June. Got a letter here, came through official channels. if you take my meaning." Elias accepted the envelope warily. Official channels meant it had gone through the territorial office, which meant someone knew exactly where to find him. June watched his face change as he read, the color draining away. "What is it?" she asked when Worth had ridden off with a handful of coins for his trouble. Luther Briggs," Elias said, his voice flat. "He's been promoted, territorial marshal now, with expanded authority, and he's coming this way on railroad business. Be here within the week." June's stomach dropped. They'd known this day would come, but somehow she'd let herself believe they had more time. "He's coming for you. For both of us, I expect." Elias crumpled the letter. "Garrison must have sent word. A runaway servant girl hiding with a wanted man Briggs won't be able to resist." That evening, they sat by the fire in heavy silence. June darned a hole in Elias's spare shirt while he cleaned his rifle for the third time. The domestic tranquility of it made her heart ache. In just a few weeks, this cabin had become more home than any place she'd ever known. "We could run," she said finally. "Head north into Canada, or west to California." "Is that what you want to spend your whole life looking over your shoulder?" She set down her sewing. "I want to stop being afraid. I want to live somewhere I can use my own name without wondering if someone's going to drag me back to May's kitchen. I want—" She stopped, heat rising in her cheeks. "What?" His voice was gentle. "What do you want, June?" The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the lines that 3 years of isolation had carved there. She'd watched those lines soften these past weeks, watched him remember how to laugh, how to hope. She'd done that, somehow, given him something to protect besides his own secrets. "I want to stay here," she whispered. "With you, but not if it means watching them destroy you." He moved then, crossing the small space between them to kneel beside her chair. His hands, calloused from axe work, were impossibly gentle as they covered hers. "June!" Just her name, but the way he said it made her shiver. "You gave me back my life. Do you understand that 3 years I've been a ghost on this mountain, forgetting why any of it mattered? Then you showed up, half frozen and nameless, and still ready to risk everything for a sick child. You reminded me that there's still good in this world worth protecting." "Elias." "I won't run. Not anymore. Briggs wants a reckoning. He'll get one. But June, if you need to leave, if you want to take that money Pike gave you and start fresh somewhere safe—" "Don't!" She pulled one hand free to touch his face, feeling the rough scrape of beard, the warmth of skin. "Don't you dare send me away for my own good. I choose to be here. I choose you." Something shifted in his gray eyes, a wall finally crumbling. He caught her hand, pressed his lips to her palm. "You don't know what you're risking." "I know exactly what I'm risking, and what I'm choosing." He rose then, drawing her up with him. For a moment they stood frozen, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. Then he whispered, so quiet she almost missed it, "You are mine forever." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possession. June's breath caught, but before she could respond, he stepped back, pain flickering across his face. "No," he said roughly. You're not property. June, not mine or anyone's. If you stay, if we face this together, it has to be because you choose it, every day, every moment, of your own free will." She studied him, this man who'd worn a badge and lost everything defending the truth, who'd saved her from the snow and then saved her again by giving her a name and a choice. Her answer came from somewhere deep and sure. "Then I choose you, Elias Wolf, today, tomorrow, and all the days after, of my own free will." He made a sound half laugh, half sob, and then she was in his arms, and his mouth was on hers, and the world beyond the cabin walls ceased to matter. The kiss was desperate and tender at once. 3 years of loneliness meeting weeks of growing certainty. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, June felt as if she'd been remade. "Stay with me tonight," he said against her hair. "Not like I mean, just stay. I need to know you're real, that this is real." She understood, after so long alone. Intimacy was its own kind of terror. "I'm real," she promised, "and I'm not going anywhere." They made a pallet by the fire, piling on furs and blankets until it was a warm nest against the winter cold, lying in his arms. June listened to his heartbeat and thought about choices and consequences. Outside, wind howled through the ice-covered trees, but here she was safe, chosen, choosing. "Tell me about before," she said softly. "When you wore the badge. Tell me who you really are." So he did, his voice rumbling through his chest where her head rested. He told her about growing up on a farm in Kansas, about losing his parents to cholera and drifting west, about finding purpose in the law, in standing for those who couldn't stand alone, about the case that changed everything, a pattern of missing payroll shipments that led to murdered guards and a web of corruption reaching into the highest offices. "I had evidence," he said. "Documents proving Collier was paying Briggs and half the railroad commission. But the night before I was going to present it to the federal marshal, they came for me, said I'd killed those guards myself, that I was the inside man, my word against a marshal's, a wealthy businessman's, and dozen bought witnesses. The evidence? Gone. My room ransacked, everything burned. I ran because staying meant hanging for crimes I was trying to solve." His arms tightened around her. 3 years. June. 3 years of knowing the truth and not being able to prove it, of watching from these mountains while they prospered on blood money. June was quiet, processing this. Then, what if you could prove it now? How the evidence is gone, the witnesses bought or dead. Briggs has more power than ever. "But he doesn't know I can read," she said slowly. "Or write." May made sure of that, didn't want me getting ideas. What if we could find new evidence? What if his coming here is actually an opportunity? Elias shifted to look down at her. "That's dangerous thinking." "Everything about us is dangerous." She traced patterns on his chest, feeling him shiver. "But I learned something living under May's roof. People with secrets get careless around those they see as furniture. Briggs won't see me as a threat. I'm just a runaway servant girl." "June, no, I won't use you as bait." "You won't be using me. I'll be choosing to act. There's a difference." They talked through the night, planning and discarding ideas as the fire burned low. When dawn came, pale and cold through the frosted windows, they had the bones of a plan. Dangerous, probably foolish, but better than waiting to be hunted. June rose to make coffee, and Elias caught her hand. "Are you sure we could still run? Start over somewhere new, somewhere safe?" She thought of all the time she'd run from May's fists, from Garrison's leering attention, from the weight of being nobody. Running had kept her alive, but it hadn't let her live. "I'm tired of running," she said, "and you are too. It's time to fight back." He pulled her down for a kiss, morning stubble rough against her skin. "Then we fight together." As she made breakfast, June felt the shape of her life changing. Last night she'd been a girl with a borrowed name hiding in the mountains. This morning, she was June Hartley, choosing to stand and fight beside the man she loved. The transformation felt as real as the ice melting from the windows as the sun rose. Briggs would come with his badges and warrants, his bought men and twisted justice, but he'd find more than he bargained for a ghost who refused to stay dead, and a woman who'd claimed her name and her life and wouldn't give them up without a fight. She carved a joy into the wooden counter as she worked, marking this moment. Not for June, that name was already hers, but for justice. The word Elias had carved into his wall, the principle that had cost him everything and might yet give it all back. "Justice is truth in action," she murmured, and began making plans of her own. The town hadn't changed much in the weeks since June had fled into the storm. Same muddy streets, same weathered buildings leaning against each other like drunks after a long night. But riding down Main Street beside Elias, she felt like a different person entirely. The scared girl who'd cowered in May's kitchen was gone. In her place sat June Hartley, chin high despite the stares and whispers that followed their passage. "That's her," someone muttered. "May's runaway." "Living in sin with that hermit?" Another voice added. "Bold as brass, showing their faces here." Elias kept his eyes forward, but June saw his jaw tighten. They'd expected this reaction, counted on it. Even word of their arrival would reach Briggs within the hour. They stopped first at the church. Reverend Pike nearly dropped his Bible when he saw them. "My dear child," he breathed, hurrying forward. "When you disappeared that night, I feared the worst." "I'm sorry I worried you," June said, dismounting. "But I found something better than I could have imagined." The old minister's eyes moved between them, taking in the way they stood together, the quiet certainty in June's bearing. "I see that. Come inside, both of you. Quickly now." The church was empty, cold despite the pot-bellied stove working hard in the corner. Pike led them to his small office behind the altar. "Marshal Briggs arrived yesterday," he said without preamble. "He's taken rooms at the Imperial Hotel. Him and 6 deputies. They're saying you murdered those guards, Mr. Wolf, that you've kidnapped June here." "I came of my own free will," June said firmly. "I believe you, child. But Briggs has the law on his side, and Mr. Garrison has been filling ears with ugly stories. May's beside herself, or so she claims. She's already filed papers stating you stole money from her when you left." June felt Elias tense beside her. "That's a lie." "Of course it is, but lies carry weight when they're backed by badges and influence." Pike moved to his desk, pulled out a leather journal. "Which is why I've been keeping records. Every beating May gave you, every time she loaned you out for labor and pocketed the wages, it's all here, dated and detailed." June stared at the journal. "You knew all this time." "I knew, and I'm ashamed I didn't do more. But I hoped that teaching you to read, giving you what protection I could, would be enough. I was a coward." "You were kind," June corrected. "That was enough to keep me alive until I could save myself." Pike handed her the journal. "This might help if things come to trial. And June, I'm glad you found your name. It suits you." Their next stop was the land office. If they were going to make a stand, they needed legal ground to stand on. The clerk, a nervous man named Paulson, went pale when Elias walked in. "Mr. Wolf, I thought, that is. We heard you were dead." "Greatly exaggerated," Elias said dryly. "I need to register a homestead claim. The land around my cabin, 40 acres total." "But, sir, there are warrants." "Are you a lawman, Mr. Paulson?" June asked sweetly. "I thought you were a clerk. And isn't it true that any citizen can file a homestead claim, regardless of legal entanglements?" Paulson darted looks between them, then at the door, clearly hoping someone would come save him from this decision. When no one did, he reluctantly pulled out the forms. "Name for the claim: June Hartley and Elias Wolf. Joint ownership," Elias said, and June felt warmth bloom in her chest. "You're not. That is, joint ownership requires marriage or business partnership." "Then put us down as partners," June said. "Business partners in the venture of survival." As Paulson filled out the paperwork with shaking hands, June noticed other details: railroad surveys on his desk, maps with parcels marked in red. One map showed their mountain valley, and her breath caught. The proposed railroad extension ran right through Elias's land. "Interesting route for the railroad," she commented casually. Paulson flushed. "It's not finalized. Just one of several options, mister. Collier is considering." June memorized the map quickly while pretending to examine a landscape painting on the wall. When they left with their filed claim, she had the beginnings of understanding. This wasn't just about silencing Elias anymore. This was about land. They want your valley, she told him as they walked toward Doc McKee's office. The railroad needs that pass, and you're sitting on it. Which explains why Briggs is here now. Clear the land of its troublesome squatter before the expansion gets approved. Elias's smile was grim. At least now we know what we're really fighting. Doc McKee was with a patient when they arrived, but his daughter Ruth, a sharp-eyed woman who served as his nurse, welcomed them warmly. "June, we heard you'd run off. Good for you. I say, that May Henshaw's a terror." "Is she hurt?" Elias asked quietly when Ruth led them to the waiting room. May hurt only in her pride and pocketbook. She'd been planning to sell June's papers to Garrison as part of their arrangement. Your leaving scotched that deal. Ruth lowered her voice. "Though between us, I think you saved yourself worse than kitchen work. Garrison's had 2 wives already. Both died young under mysterious circumstances." June shuddered. Through the examination room door, they could hear Doc McKee's patient, a woman describing symptoms that sounded like pregnancy complications. The voice was familiar. "Is that Mrs. Morrison?" June asked. "The assay clerk's wife." Ruth nodded sadly. "3rd time she's been here this month. The pregnancy isn't going well, and Jake Morrison won't pay for proper care. Says it's women's troubles and nature will handle it." June thought of Morrison leading that mob to the Crow camp, torch in hand. "What if I could help? I've assisted Doc McKee before." "June," Elias warned. "We're exposed enough as it is." But Ruth was already nodding. "Actually, that would be a blessing. Father's been run ragged lately, and another pair of trained hands." When Doc McKee emerged, he took one look at June and smiled. "Well, well, my best assistant returns. Though I hear you're June Hartley now, not May's girl." "I am, and I'd like to help, if you'll have me." The doctor glanced at Elias, understanding the risk they were taking by staying in town. "I could use the help, and having a woman assistant might actually encourage more ladies to seek treatment. But June, you know Briggs is looking for you both." "We know," Elias said. "We're done hiding." They spent the afternoon at the clinic, June working alongside Doc McKee while Elias helped move supplies and furniture. It felt good to be useful, to be choosing her actions rather than following orders. When Henrietta Morrison finally relaxed enough to let June examine her, she found what she'd suspected: the baby was breech, but still viable if they acted quickly. "We need to turn the baby," she told Doc McKee quietly. "I've seen it done, but never attempted it myself." "Then consider this your training. I'll guide you through it." It took an hour of careful manipulation, June's hands guided by the doctor's experience. When they finally felt the baby shift into proper position, Henrietta Morrison wept with relief. "Thank you," she whispered, gripping June's hands. "Jake said I was being hysterical, but I knew something was wrong." "You were right to come," June assured her. "Trust what your body tells you, and Mrs. Morrison, perhaps you could speak to your husband about the Crow. They have midwives with generations of knowledge. We could all learn from each other." The woman nodded slowly. I'll think on it. Jake gets ideas sometimes, especially when he's drinking with the boys. But maybe..." As they prepared to leave the clinic, a commotion in the street drew their attention. Marshal Luther Briggs had arrived, his silver badge glinting in the late afternoon sun. He sat his horse like a king surveying his domain, cold eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered. "I'm looking for the fugitive Ellis Wolfe," he announced. "Wanted for murder and theft. There's also a matter of stolen property, a servant girl belonging to Mrs. May Henshaw. Anyone harboring these criminals will face the full weight of the law." June felt Elias's hand on her elbow, ready to pull her back inside. But she stepped forward instead, into the street where everyone could see her. "I'm no one's property. Marshal Briggs," she called out, her voice carrying clear across the square. "My name is June Hartley, and I'm a free woman making free choices." Briggs's eyes fixed on her, and she saw cruel amusement there. "Is that so? And I suppose you have papers to prove your status? A bill of sale releasing you from your lawful indenture?" "Since when does a person need papers to prove they're human?" A murmur ran through the crowd, some sympathetic, others hostile. May herself pushed through, her face mottled with rage. "There she is, the ungrateful thief who robbed me and ran off." "I took nothing but myself," June said calmly, "and that was never yours to own." "I have a bill of sale says different." May waved a paper. "Bought and paid for, legal as any property transaction." "Then you were cheated," Elias said, stepping up beside June. "Because June Hartley is no man's property. She's my business partner, my equal, and if she'll have me my intended wife—" The words rang out like a bell. June turned to stare at him, saw the question in his eyes behind the public declaration. Her answer came without hesitation. "I will." Another murmur through the crowd, this one with more weight. A public declaration of intended marriage carried legal implications. It would make it harder for May to claim June as property. Harder for Briggs to separate them without cause. Briggs' face darkened. "Touching, but it doesn't change the warrants against you. Wolf, you'll come with me now." Or what?" Reverend Pike emerged from the crowd, his journal under one arm. "You'll shoot him down in the street, drag them both away without trial or evidence. Is that what passes for justice these days?" Marshall. "Stay out of this, preacher." "I think not. These are members of my congregation, and I'll stand with them, as will others. I suspect." And, surprisingly, others did step forward. Doc McKee and Ruth, Joseph Whitecrow, flanked by several Crow warriors who'd somehow appeared silently at the edge of the crowd. Even Paulson from the land office, though he looked terrified. Not everyone plenty melted away or stood with May and Briggs, but enough remained that the marshal had to recalculate. A shootout in the main street with the town divided wouldn't serve his purposes. "You've got 1 week," he said finally, his voice like ice. "1 week to get your affairs in order. Then I'm coming for you, Wolf, and anyone who stands in my way will hang beside you." He wheeled his horse and rode off, his deputies following like shadows. May shrieked protests, but even she knew better than to challenge Briggs's decision openly. As the crowd dispersed, June found herself shaking, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what had just happened. They'd declared themselves publicly, drawn lines and chosen sides. There was no going back now. "Did you mean it?" she asked Elias quietly. "About marriage?" He cupped her face in his hands. "Every word, though I'd planned to ask more privately, with less threat of hanging involved." She laughed, surprising herself. "Well, we've never done anything the easy way." 1 week, Doc McKee said, joining them. "That's not much time to build a defense." "It's enough," June said, thinking of the railroad maps, of patterns and connections. "We just need to find the truth and put it into action." "Justice is truth in action," Reverend Pike quoted. "I believe someone carved that once." Elias smiled grimly. Someone did. Time to live up to it. As they prepared to leave town, June felt the weight of watching eyes, but also something else, the tentative support of people who'd stood with them. It wasn't much against Briggs's authority and Garrison's money, but it was a start. 1 week to prove Elias's innocence. 1 week to establish her freedom. 1 week to build a life worth fighting for. June Hartley, who'd once been nobody, squared her shoulders and got to work. The courthouse stood at the center of Prospect's Rest like a wooden monument to frontier justice, 2 stories of rough-hewn timber with a bell tower that hadn't rung in years. On this morning, the 7th day since Briggs's ultimatum, crowds gathered early despite the bitter cold. Word had spread through the territory Elias Wolf would stand trial for murder, and the runaway girl who claimed to be free would face her own reckoning. June stood before the cracked mirror in their hotel room. pinning her hair with steady hands that belied her racing heart. She wore her best dress, actually. Her only dress besides her work clothes, a simple brown wool that Ruth McKee had altered to fit properly. "You don't have to do this," Elias said from behind her. "We could still—" "Run!" She turned to face him, seeing the fear in his eyes not for himself, but for her. "We've been through this. Our running days are over." He wore his deputy's badge openly now, polished until it shone. It was a risk, wearing the symbol of an office he'd fled, but also a statement. He was done hiding from who he was. A knock at the door interrupted them. "It's time," Reverend Pike's voice called. The walk to the courthouse felt both endless and too short. People lined the streets, some calling out support, others jeering. May Henshaw stood with Garrison near the courthouse steps, her face twisted with vindictive satisfaction. "There's the thief!" she shrieked. "Arrest her!" But June walked past without flinching, head high, hand linked with Elias's. Let them see her choosing this, choosing him. Let them understand she was no one's property. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Judge Theodore Blackwood, brought in from the territorial capital, sat behind the high bench looking deeply uncomfortable. June suspected he'd rather be anywhere else, but the stakes were too high for a local magistrate. "This is highly irregular." The judge began, glancing between the prosecution table where Briggs sat with a self-satisfied smile, and the defense where a nervous young lawyer named Nathan Hale fidgeted with his papers. Multiple charges, overlapping jurisdictions. "The law is clear, Your Honor." Briggs stood smoothly. "Elias Wolf is wanted for the murder of 2 railroad guards and theft of $30,000. The woman calling herself June Hartley is a runaway indentured servant, property of Mrs. May Henshaw. Both should be remanded immediately." The defense contests both charges. Nathan Hale rose on shaking legs. This was his first major trial, and it showed. But Reverend Pike had vouched for his integrity, and that was worth more than experience in a town where most lawyers were in Collier's pocket. Furthermore, Hale continued, gaining confidence. "We question the validity of any claim of ownership over a human being in a territory where slavery has been abolished. Indentured servitude is not slavery." Briggs countered, "It's a legal contract." "A contract signed by whom?" June stood suddenly, ignoring Elias's attempt to pull her back down. "I never signed anything. I was a child, sold like livestock between people who saw me as property. Where's the legality in that?" Judge Blackwood hammered his gavel. "Young woman, you'll speak only when called upon." "Then call upon me," June said. "Let me tell my story. Let the people hear the truth." The judge looked like he'd swallowed something sour, but nodded. "Very well. The defendant claimant, Miss Hartley, may speak to her own status. But first, we'll address the charges against Mr. Wolf." Briggs presented his case with practiced authority. According to him, Elias had used his position as deputy to learn the railroad payroll schedules, then conspired with bandits to rob the shipment. When the guards resisted, he'd killed them in cold blood. "I have witnesses," Briggs announced. And June's heart sank as 3 men took the stand. She recognized none of them, but they told their story with conviction. They'd seen Elias at the robbery site, seen him shoot the guards, seen him ride away with the gold. It was damning testimony, and Nathan Hale seemed at a loss to counter it. But then June remembered something, a detail from the medical records she'd helped Doc McKee organize. "Ask them about Elias's injury," she whispered urgently to Hale. "The old bullet wound in his leg." Hale looked confused, but stood. "Gentlemen, you claim you saw Mr. Wolf riding hard after this robbery. Tell me, did you notice any impediment in his movement, any sign of injury?" The witnesses exchanged glances. "He rode fine," one said, "like the devil was chasing him." "Interesting." Hale turned to the crowd. "Dr. McKee, would you please come forward?" The doctor made his way to the front, carrying his medical bag. "Your Honor, I examined Mr. Wolf yesterday at the defense's request. He has an old bullet wound in his left thigh that never healed properly. The damage to muscle and bone is extensive. Your point? Briggs snapped. My point, Marshal, is that a man with this injury couldn't ride at full gallop for more than a few minutes without excruciating pain. Certainly not the 20 miles to the canyon where Mr. Wolf allegedly fled. McKee pulled out a thick folder. Furthermore, I have here my treatment records from the day of the robbery. I was removing bullet fragments from Mr. Wolf's leg, the result of an earlier arrest attempt by Marshal Briggs himself. He was in my surgery from dawn to dusk, delirious with fever. He couldn't have robbed anyone. The courtroom erupted. Briggs shot to his feet. Those records could be falsified. Are you calling me a liar? Marshal, Doc McKee's voice was steel. I have served this community for 15 years. My word against yours, let the people judge who they trust. Judge Blackwood hammered for order. When quiet returned, he looked deeply troubled. This cast doubt on the witness testimony. Were there any physical evidence linking Mr. Wolf to the crime? The stolen money was never recovered, Briggs admitted grudgingly. But never recovered because Elias didn't take it, June said, standing again. This time, the judge let her speak. But someone did. Someone who needed $30,000 to buy their way into a railroad partnership. She pulled out the papers she'd been gathering all week. Hotel receipts, bank drafts, railroad incorporation documents. Your Honor, may I present evidence? The judge nodded slowly. June approached the bench, her hands steady despite her pounding heart. 3 days after the robbery, Mr. Hiram Collier made a large deposit to secure his partnership in the railroad expansion. Exactly $30,000. The same day, Marshal Briggs received a promotion and a bonus of $5,000 for exceptional service. Coincidence, Briggs snarled. Perhaps, but then there's this. June produced her final piece of evidence, a shipping manifest with an official seal. From the railroad office. See the seal, it's dated the day of the robbery. But look closely. Doc McKee examined it with a magnifying glass. The ink on the seal is different from the rest, and the date stamp, it's slightly crooked. Because it was added later. June said, to create a false timeline. Mr. Collier needed to show the money came from legitimate business, so he backdated these documents. But he made a mistake. This particular seal. The railroad didn't start using it until a month after the robbery. I verified this with the Territorial Records Office. The courtroom was silent now, everyone leaning forward. Judge Blackwood took the documents, studying them carefully. This is circumstantial at best, Briggs said, but his confidence was cracking. Then let's add more. Nathan Hale had found his courage. I call Timothy Curtis to the stand. A thin man June didn't recognize came forward nervously. I was secretary to Marshal Briggs, he stammered. I can't do this anymore. They said no one would get hurt, but those guards died. And Mr. Wolf nearly hanged for it. What are you saying? The judge demanded. Curtis pulled out a leather journal. I kept records. Everything. The marshal's meetings with Mr. Collier. The plans for the robbery, how they chose Mr. Wolf as a scapegoat because he was getting too close to the truth. It's all here. Briggs lunged for the journal, but Joseph White Crow and his companions were faster, forming a barrier. The truth will be heard, Joseph said simply. What followed was chaos. Briggs tried to flee but found the doorway blocked by townspeople. Collier, who'd been watching from the gallery, made it as far as the street before a group of miners, men who'd lost friends in his unsafe operations, stopped him. Order, Judge Blackwood shouted. Order in the court. When calm finally returned, the judge looked exhausted but resolved. Based on the evidence presented, I find insufficient grounds to hold Elias Wolf for trial. Furthermore, I'm issuing warrants for Luther Briggs and Hiram Collier on charges of conspiracy, Murder and corruption. The crowd erupted in cheers, but June barely heard them. She was focused on Elias's face, on the tears he wasn't ashamed to shed as 3 years of false accusation finally ended. Now, the judge continued, as to the matter of Miss Hartley's status. May pushed forward. She's mine. I have a bill of sale. You have a piece of paper, June said, her voice carrying over the noise. A receipt for a transaction that should shame you. I was a child, lost and alone. And instead of helping me, people sold me like goods. But I am not goods. I am June Hartley, and I choose my own path. The law, May started. The law is meant to protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. Reverend Pike interrupted. Your Honor, I have here documentation of years of abuse. Wages stolen, dignity denied. If anyone owes a debt, it's Mrs. Henshaw to June. The judge studied May's bill of sale, then, very deliberately, tore it in half. I find no legal claim of ownership over any person in my court. Miss Hartley is free to go where she wishes. May's shriek of rage was drowned out by applause. June felt Elias's arms around her, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that said everything words couldn't. But the day's drama wasn't over. Curtis's journal revealed more than just the frame-up. It detailed a network of corruption reaching to the territorial capital. Federal marshals would need to be called. The real work of justice was just beginning. As they finally left the courthouse, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose. June walked between Elias and Reverend Pike, her chosen family, while behind them Doc McKee organized care for Curtis, who'd risked everything to tell the truth. What now? She asked Elias as they paused on the steps. He touched the badge on his chest. Now we rebuild. Clean up this town. Make it worthy of the people who stood up today. He looked down at her. If you'll have me, if you'll stay. Try to get rid of me, she said, and kissed him there on the courthouse steps while the whole town watched. May's curses followed them down the street, but they were just noise now, the bitter complaints of someone whose power had been broken by truth and courage. Garrison slunk away to his ranch, his influence shattered, and somewhere in a jail cell, Luther Briggs contemplated the ruins of his empire of lies. The bell in the courthouse tower rang for the first time in years. Joseph Whitecrow and his friends had climbed up to repair it during the trial. Its bronze voice carried across the valley, announcing that justice had finally come to Prospect's Rest. June thought of the scared, nameless girl she'd been just weeks ago. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found her voice, her name, her purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There was a town to heal, corruption to root out, lives to rebuild. But tonight, walking hand in hand with Elias while their friends and neighbors called out congratulations, she was simply June Hartley, free woman, choosing her own path under the vast Montana sky. The mountains stood witness, eternal and patient, as if they'd always known this day would come. And perhaps they had. Perhaps some truths just needed the right people, at the right moment, brave enough to speak them into being. Justice is truth in action, she murmured, and felt Elias squeeze her hand. Indeed it is, he replied. Indeed it is. The weeks following the trial passed in a blur of activity. Federal marshals arrived from the territorial capital to take custody of Briggs and Collier, their investigation revealing a web of corruption that reached far beyond Prospect's Rest. The town, freed from the shadow of bought law and railroad intimidation, began to breathe again. June stood in the small room behind the church, adjusting the simple white dress Ruth McKee had helped her make. It wasn't fancy, just clean muslin with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, but it was hers, chosen and created for this moment. You look beautiful, Ruth said, pinning a spray of winter berries in June's hair. Elias won't know what hit him. Through the window, June could see people gathering in the church, not just the handful who'd stood with them during the trial, but dozens of townspeople. The Kowalski family had traveled down from the mining camp, their son healthy and strong. Joseph Whitecrow and several members of the Crow community were taking their seats, having gifted the couple a beautifully woven blanket for their new life together. "I never imagined this," June admitted. "A real wedding, with witnesses who choose to be here." "You've earned it." Ruth squeezed her shoulders. "Both of you. The town needed someone to show them courage was possible. You did that." A knock at the door interrupted them. Doc McKee peered in. "The groom's getting anxious. Keeps checking his pocket watch. You'd think after everything you two have faced, he wouldn't be nervous about a wedding." June laughed. "Tell him 5 more minutes. I've waited 20 years to have a real name and a real life. He can wait 5 more minutes to make it official." When she finally walked down the aisle, Reverend Pike's organ playing filling the small church, June felt the weight of every eye upon her, but she only saw Elias, standing at the altar in his best suit with that deputy's badge polished bright. His gray eyes were soft with emotion as she approached. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Pike began, his voice carrying strong despite his age, "we gather today to witness something precious, 2 people choosing each other, choosing to build a life together against all odds." The ceremony was simple but meaningful. When Pike asked if anyone objected, there was a long silence. June half expected May to burst through the doors, shrieking protests, but the only sound was the winter wind rattling the windows. "Do you, Elias Wolfe, take June Hartley to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. "Today and every day after." "And do you, June Hartley, take Elias Wolfe to be your lawfully wedded husband?" June thought of all the names she'd tried on in the darkness of May's cellar, all the lives she'd imagined for herself. None of them had been as good as this reality. "I do, of my own free will and with my whole heart." When Pike pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next county. Elias kissed her there at the altar, a promise sealed before witnesses who'd chosen to stand with them. The reception was held in the church hall, tables groaning under the weight of food brought by neighbors. June was surprised to see Henrietta Morrison there, looking healthier than she had in months. "I wanted to thank you," the woman said quietly, "for saving my baby, and for what you said about the Crow midwives. I've been learning from them. My husband, Jake's trying to be better, seeing Marshal Briggs hauled away in chains, learning how we'd all been fooled. It changed things." "Change is hard," June acknowledged. "But it's possible. Look at us, a nameless orphan and a falsely accused lawman, standing here married and free." As the afternoon wore on, June found herself watching Elias work the room. The town council had approached him about taking on the role of sheriff officially, now that the corruption had been rooted out. He was considering it. She knew, weighing his desire to serve against the bitter memories of betrayal. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Wolfe." She turned to find him beside her, 2 cups of punch in hand. "Just thinking how strange life is. A month ago I was nobody. Now I'm June Hartley Wolfe, married woman with a legal name and a home of my own." "Our home," he corrected, handing her a cup. "Though I've been thinking about that. The cabin served me well, but it's small for 2. Maybe it's time to build something new, something that's ours from the foundation up." "I'd like that, though I'll miss the cabin. It's where I became June. We'll keep it for when we need to escape. But I think our life is down here now, with these people." He gestured to the crowded hall. "They need leadership, protection, hope. We can give them that." Nathan Hale approached them then, looking far more confident than he had during the trial. Success had given him backbone. "Sheriff Wolfe, Mrs. Wolfe, I wanted to let you know the territorial government is setting up a commission to investigate railroad practices. They want you both to testify." "We'll be there," Elias assured him. "The work's not done yet." As evening fell and guests began to drift away, June found herself in the church's side room, teaching a group of women to write their names. It had started spontaneously, one woman admitting she'd never learned, June offering to show her, and now 6 women sat around the table, carefully forming letters. "This is how change really happens," Reverend Pike said, watching from the doorway. "Not just in dramatic trials, but in quiet rooms where people learn they're capable of more than they thought." June helped a miner's wife spell out Margaret Sullivan in careful script. "Everyone deserves a name. Everyone deserves to sign their own documents, tell their own story." "Speaking of stories," Pike said, producing a leather-bound journal. "This is for you. To record your journey, the story of June Hartley Wolfe should be remembered." June accepted the journal reverently, her story not as property or servant, but as herself. "Thank you for everything, for teaching me to read, for standing with us, for never giving up hope. You taught me more," the old minister said. "You taught me that quiet acceptance of injustice is its own kind of sin. I won't make that mistake again." Later, as June and Elias prepared to leave for their wedding night at the hotel their friends had insisted, decorating the best room with winter roses and new linens, Timothy Curtis approached them hesitantly. "Mr. and Mrs. Wolfe, I wanted to apologize, and to thank you. I know testifying doesn't make up for my part in the lies, but you found your courage when it mattered." Elias interrupted. "That's what counts. What will you do now?" "I thought I might stay. If the town will have me, try to make amends. Mr. Hales offered me work as a legal clerk. Honest work this time." June smiled at the young man. "Redemption's possible for anyone brave enough to seek it. Welcome to your second chance. Mr. Curtis." As they walked through the quiet streets toward the hotel, snow began to fall soft, clean flakes that covered the muddy streets in pristine white. June thought it fitting. The town was covering its ugly past with something new and pure. "No regrets?" Elias asked as they paused outside the hotel. "How could I regret this?" June gestured to the transformed town, the ring on her finger, the man beside her. 6 weeks ago I had nothing, no name, no choices, no future. Now I have everything." "We have everything," he corrected, pulling her close. "Together." From somewhere in the distance came the sound of singing the Crow community celebrating around their fires, their voices carrying on the wind. It mixed with the church bells that someone had set ringing, a joyful cacophony that spoke of communities coming together, of walls breaking down. "What's next, do you think?" June asked as they climbed the hotel stairs. "Tomorrow you start teaching more women to read and write. I start cleaning up what's left of the sheriff's office. We build that new house. We help this town become what it should have been all along." He paused at their door. "We live, June, freely and fully." She thought of the scared girl in the blizzard, nameless and alone, certain she would die in the snow. That girl could never have imagined this, a husband who saw her as an equal, a community that valued her contributions, a future bright with possibility. "You know what I want to do first," she said as Elias opened the door to their flower-strewn room. "I want to write it all down, every bit of it, so other girls like me know that they can choose their own names, their own lives, that being nobody doesn't mean you have to stay nobody. Then we'll get you all the paper and ink in the territory," Elias promised. "Your story should be told." As the door closed behind them and the snow continued to fall, June Hartley Wolfe began composing the first lines of her story in her head. "I had no name for 20 years. This is how I found one. And in finding it, found myself. Somewhere in the night, wolves howled in the distant mountains, not threatening now, just wild creatures living their lives. The sound no longer frightened June. She was no longer prey, running from predators. She was a woman with a name, a home, a purpose. She was the author of her own story. And the story was just beginning. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, It transformed the valley into a paradise of wildflowers and rushing streams. June stood on the hill overlooking Prospect's Rest, her manuscript clutched against her chest, watching the town that had become her true home. 5 years had passed since that winter day when she'd chosen her name. 5 years of building, growing, becoming. The town below was barely recognizable from the corrupt mining settlement it had been. New buildings lined the main street, a proper schoolhouse, a library, a medical clinic where she and Doc McKee trained midwives and nurses. Mama, look. June turned to see her daughter racing up the hill, blonde braids flying, clutching a handful of the first columbines of the season. At 4 years old, Margaret Elias Wolfe, named for June's first student and her beloved husband, was a force of nature, bright and fierce and absolutely certain of her place in the world. Beautiful, sweetheart, June said, kneeling to accept the flowers. Should we put them on Reverend Pike's grave? Margaret nodded solemnly. The old minister had passed peacefully the previous winter, but not before seeing his congregation triple in size and his community transformed. His final sermon had been about redemption and the courage to change themes that resonated through the valley. As they walked to the small cemetery, June reflected on all that had changed. May Henshaw had left town shortly after the trial, her boarding house purchased by a collective of women who ran it as a safe haven for those escaping bad situations. Timothy Curtis was now a respected lawyer, having taken over Nathan Hale's practice when the latter was appointed as a territorial judge. The Crow community and the town had formed a formal alliance, sharing resources and knowledge, their children attending school together. "Is Papa coming?" Margaret asked, carefully placing flowers on Pike's headstone. "He should be here soon. He had to finish with the cattle rustler case." Elias had accepted the sheriff's position officially, but on his own terms. He'd insisted on appointing deputies from both the town and the Crow community, creating a force that truly served all people. Crime had dropped dramatically, not through fear, but through justice fairly applied. A rider appeared on the road below, and Margaret shrieked with delight. "Papa!" Elias dismounted at the cemetery gate, catching his daughter as she launched herself at him. At 37, he'd lost the haunted look that had marked him during his years in hiding. Purpose had restored him, just as love had saved them both. "How's my wildflower?" he asked Margaret, then looked over her head at June. "And my June flower?" "We're perfect," June said, moving into his embrace. "The manuscript is finished. All of it, the whole story." She nodded. "From the day I woke up in your cabin to Margaret's birth, everything." They'd decided together that her story should be told not for fame or sympathy, but as a beacon for others who felt trapped by circumstance. A publisher in Denver had already expressed interest after reading her initial chapters. "Read it to me tonight," Elias asked. "Every word if you want." They walked home together, Margaret riding on Elias's shoulders, chattering about her day. Their house, built with their own hands and the help of neighbors, stood on a rise overlooking both the town and the mountains. It was modest but solid, with room for the family they were building and the students June taught. As they approached, June saw a familiar wagon in the yard. "Is that Sarah?" Margaret squealed, spotting her best friend. The Kowalski family had indeed come to visit. Stefan and his wife emerged from their wagon, followed by young Thomas, now 11 and strong as a young ox, and Sarah, Margaret's age and her constant companion when the families met. "June Elias, Mrs." Kowalski called out, "We have news." Over dinner, the news spilled out. The territorial government, influenced by the commission June and Elias had testified before, was establishing new protections for workers and clearer laws about contracts and employment. No more selling of people, especially children. Stefan said firmly, "Your testimony about being sold as a child. June, it changed minds, made them see what such practices really meant." June felt tears prick her eyes. "I never imagined my story could change laws." "Stories change the world," Elias said, squeezing her hand. one heart at a time. After dinner, as the children played and the adults talked, June noticed a rider approaching fast. Her heart clenched even now. Urgent riders could mean trouble, but when the figure resolved into Joseph Whitecrow, she relaxed. Friends. Joseph dismounted, his usually calm face animated. I bring good news. The railroad, they've agreed to reroute around sacred lands, and they've hired our people as guides and workers, with fair wages. It was the culmination of years of negotiation, another victory born from the changes that had rippled out from that winter of truth. The railroad would come. Progress was inevitable, but it would come on terms that respected all people. As evening fell and their guests departed, June sat on the porch with her manuscript. Margaret curled sleepy in her lap. Elias sat beside them, his arm around both his girls. Read me the last part, he requested. June turned to the final pages, her own handwriting covering the sheets. She'd labored over this ending, wanting to capture not just events, but the feeling of transformation. I had no name for 20 years, she read. Now I have many names. June to my friends, Mrs. Wolf to my students, Mama to my daughter, Beloved to my husband. Each name is a choice, a gift, a responsibility. She continued, reading about the school she'd established, teaching not just letters but self-worth to women and girls who'd been told they were nothing. About the lending library she and Ruth McKee had started, bringing books and learning to the farthest mining camps. About the laws changed and lives transformed because people had chosen courage over comfort. But perhaps the most important name I carry is the one I chose that night in a stranger's cabin, when I decided I was worth saving. June, the month of new growth, of long days and warm nights, of life triumphant over winter's death. Every day I live up to that name, choosing hope over fear, justice over silence, love over indifference. Margaret had fallen asleep, her small hand clutching June's dress. In the distance, wolves howled, not threatening now, just part of the wild chorus of the mountains. The girl who had no name found more than just words to call herself, June concluded. She found her voice, her purpose, her family. She found that names have power, but only the power we give them. And the greatest power of all is the ability to name ourselves, to write our own stories, to choose who we become. She closed the manuscript, looking out at the valley bathed in twilight. Somewhere down there, other women were learning to write their names for the first time. Former servants were becoming business owners. Children who might have been sold were instead attending school. It's perfect, Elias said softly. Pike would be proud. I hope so. I hope it helps someone, somewhere, believe they can change their story. It already has. He reminded her. Every woman you've taught, every girl who sees you standing tall, you've already changed dozens of stories. As if to emphasize his point, Margaret stirred in her sleep, murmuring, Mama, with complete security. This child would never wonder if she had worth, never question her right to choose her own path. You are mine forever, Elias whispered, echoing the words he'd spoken that night by the fire. But now June understood them differently. Not possession, but promise. Not ownership, but belonging, the kind chosen freely, renewed daily. And you are mine, she whispered back. Forever and by choice. As they carried Margaret inside to her bed, June paused at the door to look back at the mountains. They stood eternal against the darkening sky, witnesses to all that had changed and all that endured. Tomorrow she would send her manuscript to Denver. Tomorrow she would teach more women to read, help deliver another baby, work alongside Elias to keep their communities safe and just. But tonight, she was simply June Hartley Wolfe, a woman with a name she'd chosen, a life she'd built, and a future bright with possibility. The nameless girl was gone, transformed into something stronger, a woman who knew that every person deserved the right to write their own story. And, in the end, that was the greatest justice of all, the truth that every soul had worth. Every person deserved a name, and everyone had the power to choose who they would become. It had taken her 20 years to learn that truth, but now she would spend the rest of her life teaching it to others. The mountain stood guard as the little family settled in for the night, their home a beacon of warmth in the vast darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, another lost soul might be struggling, nameless and afraid. But June's story would find them, would whisper the truth she'd learned in blood and snow and triumph. You are more than what others call you. You have the power to name yourself, and in naming yourself, you become free. The spring wind carried that promise across the valley, over the mountains, into the world beyond, and June Hartley Wolfe slept peacefully, knowing her story, their story, would light the way for others to find their own names, their own freedom, their own happily ever after. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss your thoughts on June's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of courage and self-discovery in the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Night and like this video, and hit the hype button to help more people discover these stories of hope and transformation. Your support means the world and helps keep these narratives alive for others who need to hear them.